sorry about the delay. I had to grab a quick snack yet because I haven't eaten dinner. So, hi. I hope everyone's doing well. So we're going to continue Apothecaria from last Sunday. It is going to be the third and fourth weeks in game. Again, these ones have already been pre-played. These are from streams that happened last year. And we're just tweaking kind of how the flow of this goes, and we're replaying these just to kind of do a rehash, especially since the VODs aren't up anymore. The VOD for last week's session isn't available. That's because we had some sound issues. So it will end up on my YouTube eventually, but I'm going to have to re-record it. So probably that one, and then the VOD from this week will end up on my YouTube sometime within this next week. So I think honestly we'll probably just get right into it. Last week we arrived in High Rannoc with Marcius and discovered that the local witch was missing and no one seemed to know what had happened to her. We found her journal, but it didn't really give us any clues. And so we decided to stay in town and investigate both her disappearance and help the townspeople, since they no longer had a witch in town. We met a few different people. We met Damien and his mother, who were vendors within the market in the town. We met an adventurer whose name we never got, who was suffering from dragon sickness and unfortunately failed to cure him. And we met Follix the dwarf, who was out fishing on the loch. We also found a message in a bottle at the loch that we responded to. That we don't know who it's from or where it came from or if we'll even get a response. And I believe we will simply be picking up right there. Let's get switched over. And I checked the volume levels before stream, so hopefully they still work. But I do have background music and sounds in place. And again, while we're going through this, since this is kind of a reading through it stream, I won't really be responding to chat. Any follows or anything that I get, I will shout out at the end of the stream. Alright, so here we go. April 3rd, third week of spring. The last few days have been quiet. After the close call with the Kusith, I have decided to remain close to the house for a little while. The place is finally starting to feel like my own in small ways, but there still lingers a ghost of its previous tenant. I have the cloth from the narwhal's team flag pinned to my wall in the small bedroom, my only clue still to the whereabouts of the former witch. Her journal, though informative on the area, doesn't give any further indication of where she has gone. Tonight, as I was finishing my dinner, a knock on the door stirred me from my thoughts, and I was surprised given the hour. I opened the door to find myself confronted with the same adventurer who had visited my first week here, and I immediately moved aside to let him in. I felt a drop of guilt in my chest looking at him, seeing all the ways he'd looked worse for wear. He was having a moment of clarity, though, as he pushed his way into the house. The dragon sickness was clearly still in him. There was a weight about him that spoke of many hidden things away in his pockets, stolen trinkets that he had no doubt managed to swipe in the last couple of weeks since I'd saw him. He gave me an accusatory look that I honestly couldn't blame him for, given the way I had failed previously. Without a word from him, I promised that I would try once more to cure him of his ailment before it overcame him. High Rannoc, Case Number 3, Adventurer, Postscript, Leo. Suffering from dragon sickness. This sickness can be cured with reagents that treat scents and wounds, and there are 4 turns that can be taken. I knew better now than to put all my eggs into one basket, so I took a moment to examine the notes in the previous witch's journal to ensure I knew the best locations to find what I would need. I'd have to go to 2 different places in a short amount of time, and both of them were spots I had yet become familiar with just yet. It was still a risk, but I had a better chance of finding what I needed, even with the split efforts. Hero's Hollow. I left in a hurry once I had a plan in place, uneasy under the adventurer's intense gaze until I was finally at the door and down the path. My time was limited, and there was unlikely to be a third chance to help him if I failed again. I decided to go to the hollow first. It was the furthest from the house and most likely to give me trouble. I had heard some talk of the dungeon that rested in the hollow in town, and that was where I'd have to go to find the hermit snail I needed. I will admit that given the close call of the Kusith just a few days prior, that I felt it was more dangerous traveling at night in the area than I had previously estimated. There was a different feel to it when you started to become familiar with the specific source of dangers that lurked in the place, compared to the general acceptance that trouble of some sort likely existed around you when you wandered from place to place. It made me feel on edge in situations I know I'd likely once have passed through with ease, unaware of the sort of trouble that may sneak up on you. It was almost a relief when I came across the hollow. The old cracked visage of whatever former beast had left the boulder skull behind that created the entrance of the place gazing hollowly up at the sky. It was overgrown and fossilized after centuries of sitting there, but you could still make out its empty features. Card drawn is a 9. Timer is set at 4. The entrance of the dungeon was clear to see, plainly marked with warnings that were defaced in what clearly were some juvenile skulls. It seemed likely that at least the upper level wasn't too hostile, and I felt almost safer within the confines of the dungeons as I started my exploration. I watched carefully along the walls for signs of the hermit's nails as I went deeper. I was disappointed as I explored the first level, and found it to be dry and dusty, knowing that the snails would prefer areas that were moist. It took far longer than I had hoped as I trailed further down through the cave, following careful markings on the wall to keep track of my path before the damp set in, and a chill began to make my bones ache. The water dripped through the cracks in the walls, this far down, and I grinned as I started to see the signs of the slime trails I had been watching for. I followed along a set of them and took care where I stepped as I looked for shells that I could gather. At last, I took one final turn and came across a small scattered set of abandoned casings. I worked on gathering them, hearing what I had thought was the sounds of snails trailing themselves across the stone floors just out of sight. As I finished getting what I would need, however, there was a hiccuping sob that made it clear that whatever was towards the back of the cavern was more human than I had thought. I cursed under my breath as I debated between calling out to help whoever it may have been, or just continuing on my way, knowing I already had someone else as my responsibility back home. I hate to admit it, but as soon as I turned and left without but I almost turned and left without a word. I had already managed to disappoint the adventurer who waited for me. I figured that surely anyone who had wandered into the dungeon would know their way back out if any real trouble had come about. I hadn't been able to bring myself to leave the entrance to the cavern, though, and that hesitation made my choice for me. I heard someone call out from the darkness, asking me to please not leave him. I gave a sigh of resignation as I cast the light out so that I could see who I was speaking to, and found a young man who looked shaken and pleading. He stumbled towards me as he explained that it was his first time adventuring down into the dungeon, and that he'd gotten turned around. I hardly had any chance to speak as the words tumbled out of him, and he pleaded that I take him back with me, going so far as to offer me 10 silver for doing so. I knew I wouldn't forgive myself if I abandoned him, especially now, so I sighed and agreed. It wasn't like I wouldn't have needed to make my way out of the dungeon as it was. I had hoped it wouldn't take long for us to work our way back to the surface, but I found that he clung to me at every step of the way. I doubt very much that he'd been an adventurer for much longer if this was how he handled himself, and I fought to keep my irritation at the wasted time tampered down, since I knew it would do us no good. When we finally stepped back out of the dungeon, I accepted the silver he'd promised and hurried him on his way back to town, so I could head towards the woods in search of the second reagent I needed. Even this took more time than I had hoped. Even this took more time than I wanted, as I made a show of the entire ordeal before he finally parted ways with me, and I prayed I had enough time left. I rushed towards the woods with the thought of finding some scramble bramble along either a steep hill or along the river. I knew the river would be closest, so I strayed towards the bank the moment I was between the trees, so I could follow the trickling water, ever grateful for the moonlight that made it possible for me to carefully make my way. I pulled on my thick gloves as I walked so that I had them ready when I found the brambles, since I would need to be quick to keep them from running off of me. Card drawn, a 5. Timer is set at 3. I spotted someone ahead of me through the trees, and assumed at first that it was the young man from the dungeon again. Frustration rose up as I opened my mouth to give him hell for somehow getting turned around in the dark when the town should have been easy to find. I bit my tongue quickly, though, before the ire of my words could escape, as the figure turned to where I could make out the telltale shape of antlers upon their head. I must have looked rather dumbstruck as the druid greeted me, as they appeared to almost be one of the plants themselves in the moonlight, like a tree that had come to life to greet me as they waved for me to come closer. They were dressed in earthen hues, with vines of the plant they held curled around one of their arms. It took me a moment to realize that this was the very bramble that I needed cradled in their grasp. Scattered beneath their feet was an array of other forest plants as well, including the wild rose. I apologized for interrupting their night and was given assurances that it was no trouble. They gave me their name, Emrys, and asked if I needed help, and I took the chance of explaining the circumstances of the adventurer who waited back at the house for me, and what I needed for his cure. They listened with intent, and when I finished it was clear they'd gotten my meaning. Emrys whispered to the brambles they held in their arm before they took a cutting of it to hand to me, along with some of the wild rose as extra. The brambles gave no fight, as I was used to them doing, made no attempt to run, but let emeries gather the trimmings calmly. I apologized for being in a hurry then. Wished I could have stayed long to speak with emeries, as it was clear that they were likely the one tending the forest paths, and would have been an excellent source of knowledge. I knew I needed to leave, though, and there was a fleeting sense of promise that we would try to meet up once more. I hurried back to the house then, worried that I had once more missed my opportunity to help the adventurer with his ailment, but determined to try. The relief I felt was palpable when I entered the home to find him sitting anxiously at the table. In front of him had been a scattered set of gems, some that I recognized as being the ones he had taken his first time here. He gave me a tense look, and I set to work right away. I was still on the clock, and if he'd lost his sense before I was done, I would be able to do little to stop him from leaving. Ending obsession. Potion has a +1 to poison. Ingredients: hermit snail ×1 boiled. Scramble bramble ×1 crushed and boiled. Step 1. Take the hermit snail shells in 2 cups of water. Add both to the pot over a roaring fire. Bring to a boil, distance from heat so it simmers for 10 minutes. Step 2. While that boils, take your scrambled bramble and remove the thorns. Crush these into a fine dust with the mortar and pestle. Step 3. After 10 minutes have passed, strain the liquid from the hermit snail shells into a bowl and discard the shells. Return the liquid to the pot and add the crushed scrambled bramble thorns. Step 4. Return to the heat and boil once more. Step 5. Once brought to a boil, remove from heat and allow to cool for a few moments before pouring a cup of the concoction for the patient. Step 6. Patient should drink the potion like a tea while still warm. If desired to gather chosen items does not subside within 10 minutes, administer another cup. Do not exceed 3 cups of fluid, as the poison buildup of the scrambled brambles can cause ill effects. It took 2 cups of the ending obsession potion before the adventurer no longer seemed to feel the compulsion to scoop up the gems and run. He said his platitudes of thanks, exhausted but relieved, looking as he realized that the ordeal was over. I wanted to ask him how he had managed to come down with the dragon sickness to begin with, but didn't feel it was appropriate. I let him stay the night in the small living room given the late hour and his clear level of fatigue. Feeling exhausted myself, I set to bed as well, and found that sleep came quick and heavy. In the morning when I woke, I found my payment on the table, with a note stating simply, "Thank you for your help. I need to go and check back on my family. Leo." As we successfully cured his ailment at the end of the week, we did a reputation bump. We earned 10 silver from the adventure in the dungeon, and then we earned another 20 silver from him for curing his ailment. April 4th. When I found myself alone that morning, I got up long enough to make myself something to eat before returning to bed, as I still felt exhausted from being up so long into the night. By the time the afternoon rolled around, I was awake once more and determined to return to that spot by the river to see if I could find any sign of the druid. I knew that it was unlikely I'd find them there, but I had just enough hope that I'd find some clue where I may be able to find them at the very least. Card drawn, a 7. It took me a bit to find my way down to the specific spot by the river, but I knew I'd found it when I came across the blanket of wild rose that still bloomed along the forest floor in the afternoon sun. I bent down to gather some, but as I did, a small form peeked out at me from behind a tree trunk. I thought it was a child at first, but a burst of melodious laughter that seemed to surround me let me know that I had stumbled upon a group of pixies. Despite knowing that they may bring some mischief, I gave the one who'd come into view a small smile, as I've always felt fondness towards the little sprites. This was enough welcome for them to all appear, a chorus of "Play with us" echoing around me as 4 of them surrounded me. They challenged me to a caber toss, something I'm ill-suited for, but I played along as they led me to where a couple of downed trees were nearby that were about the right size for the game. If I could manage to squeeze out a victory, perhaps they could direct me towards where to find the druid. The pixies went first, and as soon as they threw their cabers, I knew that it was going to be a lost cause. They grinned like children who knew their parents couldn't keep up with their games, their joy deprived from the ease of their victory. Still, I gave it an honest attempt when it was finally my turn to show my sportsmanship and to allow them their fun. Despite my best toss, I fell far short of their distance, and I heard their laughter as they sang out about my failure. They danced around me, demanding a treasure as their prize, which was something I hadn't before thought to plan for. I attempted to convince them that the wild rose that had been growing near the river was treasure enough, but it was clear they expected it to be something that was mine. A curse, then, one of them had declared, and I fought back the impulse to argue my case, as I knew they weren't likely to hear my excuses. Pixie curses can range from mostly harmless to surprisingly vicious, but I felt assured I hadn't offended them to the point of true harm, as they joined their hands around me to place their curse. You forgot a prize, a treasured thing, and so you shall lose a blink. A moment passed, for a week each day will pass just slightly too fast. As they finished their curse, they immediately fell into laughter before running back into the woods. I could feel the lingering magic in the air, and knew that I had lost a bit of something I wouldn't be getting back until they deemed it was necessary. In the end, the loss of some time for a week would make it harder to get things accomplished. Not impossible, though. With no sign of the druid, and the fact that I'd managed to land myself with a pixie curse, I decided to head back home for the rest of the day. I knew I needed to get back to town the next day for another round of shopping for weekly supplies, and I needed to make a list of what I needed the most. Joker was drawn. Clue from the first steps is allowed. Card for the clue that was drawn is the king. I passed the pile of downed trees that we had pulled from for our capers, and something caught my eye, tucked underneath a gathering of them. The trees had landed in a way that seemed to almost make a small shelter, and between some of the trunks I could see what almost appeared to be a table inside. I moved around the pile to try to find an entrance, and after a few times I realized there was a cobweb covered opening on a side where the brush had grown up to conceal it. I pushed my way inside to find a small camp set up in the center. Hidden as it was clear no one had been there for a while. A lantern sat on the table, and there was a small cot tucked back in the corner that was big enough for a person to rest on. Leaves and dirt was scattered about, but on the table there was a simple map with notes scribbled wildly across it. I took a closer look and recognized that familiar scrawl of handwriting once more, and realized that the structure had clearly been visited by the previous witch in the past. The markings on the map seemed to be noting different locations around town, including some small sites that had been numbered names. I rolled the map up carefully, scanned over the shelter for any more clues or items that had been left behind, before leaving myself. I've spent the evening examining it now, trying to determine if there's any other sign of what she had been looking for. All I've been able to determine exactly is that the site I had discovered was marked on the map with an X and the number 4. I can only assume the other marked areas were similar camps to that one. I will have to make a point of visiting these other locations to see if there are really other camps, and if there are any other clues at them. April 5th. It was hard to resist heading out this morning to immediately explore the other locations on the map, but I knew I needed to go into town to get more food and other supplies. I also knew it was best that I had a plan in place before tackling all the locations, as there was no certain guarantee that they were more bases like the one I had found, or that they'd all be safely abandoned either. I headed into the market instead for the day, stopping shortly to say hello to Damien and his mother. He seemed to be doing well and has had no further issue with his magnetized thumb since they had come for the cure last week. I did my shopping, mind distracted with thoughts of the map, but I made myself take some time to further explore the town to make my presence more familiar there. I was still finding the townspeople were not overly friendly, though none of them were outwardly aggressive either. I just felt that there was some lingering sense of suspicion there. Card drawn was an ace. I settled next to the fountain around lunch to eat, and found myself the subject of different stares and whispers. I tried not to pay them any mind, and not to let my defensive nature rise up to the surface. I realized that someone was heading directly towards me, about mid-meal, and it took me until he'd sat down beside me to recognize him as the young adventurer from the dungeon the other night. He was already talking at a quick pace by the time I processed this, though, and I managed to catch that his name was Sean. I thought I was able to smooth over the laughs without too much awkwardness, as I told him I was glad to see he had made it back to town safely. He scoffed at the apparent suggestion that he might not have been capable of getting back on his own, but I still had my own doubts, given how he'd clung to me in the dungeon when we'd crossed nothing more than some snails. He rambled for a while, exclaiming that I was fortunate we had crossed paths so he could follow me out of the dungeon, so he could help ensure we weren't set upon by anything. I felt the creep of skepticism on my face, as it seemed more and more like he'd forgotten about how he'd been frozen to the spot before I found him. I knew it was likely better not to, but I still attempted to gently remind him of the level of need he'd been in. I didn't want to cause a stir in the middle of town, but I was irritated by his attempt to bend the story to one where he hadn't been the one needing the help at all, especially given it had cost me precious time in finding the cure for Leo, who I had managed to help only in part because of my luck with the druid. Sean seemed immediately upset that I wasn't concurring with his version of events, but he didn't get up to leave either. Instead, he insisted that I had been the one who needed the help more than him, and this caused me to laugh outright despite the pout on his face. I could tell that he was getting upset, and I apologized despite myself, though I made a point of explaining that things had seemed rather different that late at night. I could hear the biting tone in my voice, the sarcasm, as I insisted that I must have been mistaken, but it seemed to be enough that I gave some room for his edits to the tale. His expression tightened a little at the clear mocking, but I wondered if I hadn't walked that line well enough to keep it from turning into a scene. The moment passed, though. Someone called for him, and he quickly excused himself to go off toward a small flock of other men his age. No doubt he felt he had to put on a show for them, but I wouldn't be a part of it any longer. I could hear them talk about his time in the dungeon, as I gathered my things up and I made certain to remove myself from the town center before any further attention or questions could be brought my way. Marcius. That is the end of week 3. April 10th, 4th week of spring. I can hardly believe that I've been in High Rannoc for almost a month now. Given the fact that I never considered settling down in one place before, it has been an unexpected change to find myself feeling content here. That's not to say I don't still long to get back to my travels, but there is something to be said for having a place to return to each day. My momentary contentment has not taken my mind off the mystery that ties me here in the first place. The tattered remains of the team flag that I've now accepted holds little true importance. Is pinned to the wall above the desk in the bedroom. Her journal sits beneath it with a freshly discovered map of potential places of interest numbered off across it yet to be explored. I had hoped to set out to do such an exploration this morning, when I was interrupted by a group of young friends from town showing up on my doorstep. They introduced themselves as adventurers, but I recognized them as belonging to the same group as the young man I'd helped out of the dungeon previously. They dragged with them one of their friends, who seemed rather confused and dazed to be there. At first I thought it was simply a case of a hangover, or even a serious cold, the way he was shivering when his friend set him down near my hearth. But then I noticed the 2 bite marks on his lower neck, where I met his shoulder. After a closer examination, his friends all hovering and beaming, giving their expert opinions, it was clear that he had been drunk upon by a vampire rather recently. The shivering was due to both the loss of blood and the fact that he'd apparently been leaving his window open at night, even with the chill that still settled heavily in the air in the early mornings. I turned to his friends then, forcing their surmising about his condition to turn into answering questions instead, as I tried to ascertain just where he may have crossed paths with a vampire. Suddenly, they were all silent, and it was clear they were far more aware of what had been happening than they had initially let on. Wherever they had crossed paths with the vampire was either somewhere they were not supposed to have been, or there was something there they didn't want found. It would be better if I knew, but I also knew that at the moment my focus was best kept on helping their friend. I told them all to remain at the house and to make certain he stayed warm by the fire. I pulled out some things for him to eat and instructed them to make sure he did so to help give him some of his strength back as well. Once I felt certain I had impressed these instructions upon them, I set out. High Rannoc had proven to apparently draw in some of the worst things that roam the countryside. Hopefully with some care and a word passed along to the guards in town, this vampire wouldn't have any more attacks. High Rannoc, case number 4, adventurer/local, suffering from drunk. This can be treated with reagents that treat blood, cold, and senses. I would originally have 8 turns, but due to the pixie curse from the previous week, this gets limited down to 6 due to the curse. Moonbreaker Mountain. I had several reagents I was going to need to gather in order to help prevent the young man from ending up turning vampiric himself. I started towards Moonbreaker Mountain, knowing that I would find at least 2 of the reagents there, and given the limited time I had already noticed setting in due to the Pixie's curse, I'd have to act fast. I hiked up the same trail I'd been on the week before, but headed further up, passing the runestone I'd stopped at previously. As I did, I scanned my surroundings, wondering briefly if I would see the elvish man once more, but the area seemed abandoned in the early morning hours. Card drawn was a 6. I was sweating and out of breath by the time I reached what would be considered the halfway mark if I was to climb to the top of the peak. I hoped I could avoid that, but I'd yet to spot an area that seemed likely to hold the items I needed. I came to a stop next at an old shrine to gather my breath and my bearings as I looked up at the craggy rocks above that cut silhouettes against the sky. I loathed to think I would need to go that high up, but knew there was a chance I would. I looked closer at the shrine then, a small thing put together for the goddess of the woods, Nihilus, who was still worshipped and praised in this region. I said a quiet sort of prayer myself as I took in the scattered offerings that had been left at the bottom of the shrine. Nihilus had different names in different areas, but I had found her figure seemed to be present across most regions I had traveled through. She was a preferred goddess to pray to for those who relied upon the land, and, given the nature of my work, I had always made a point to stop and pay some tribute when I crossed paths with similar shrines as this. As I did so now, some serendipitous guidance brought my eyes upon one of the very nests I had been hoping to come across. In one of the trees a ways off the trail, high enough that it would be a pain to get to, but not so high as to be impossible, was the large clump of an eagle's nest among the branches. It was a different structure than the falcon's nest I had crossed down by the loch. These eagles built their nests up so that it was entirely encapsulated, huge and almost wasp-like in shape, both the entrance at the top. From the looks of it, this was an older nest, one that had been built in the years before. It'd been used again, but it was too early in the year still for the inhabitants to have returned with that purpose in mind. I hiked off the main trail and up to the trunk of the tree as I laid out my plan of action for climbing up it. The way the tree branches were laid out, I felt I would be able to scramble up the tree without too much cursing and struggling. Climbing trees was much easier when I was younger, but I still managed it. I propped myself up on a sturdy seeming branch just beneath the nest, and very carefully took a scraping of materials. I placed it into one of the small jars from my satchel, sealed it, and tucked it safely away before trying to find my way back down. Down proved to be more difficult than up. I had always felt seemed silly that cats could get stuck up in trees. Surely, if they climbed up, they could climb down. I can no longer hold this criticism against the poor beasties, though, as I faced with the task on my own. I found it quite daunting. Despite my best efforts, I ended up sliding rather roughly down the last few feet and scraped along the bark of the tree as I did. Cursing, I checked that my jar was still secure before focusing on the task at hand, which was to find some cynic ivy. Joker card was drawn, which means another clue from the first steps can be found. Card for the clue drawn is an 8. And then card for proceeding drawn is a queen. Timer is set at 5. I made a point to say a quiet thanks to the shrine once more as I returned to the trail to continue up towards the rocky top of the mountain. I was met with rain. As I got higher up, a light sprinkle at first, but it increased to a steady drizzle as I went. I kept my head ducked low, trying not to dwell on what I had done to draw such bad luck to myself in the recent weeks, as I rounded a corner, only to find the path partially blocked by what, at first, seemed to be a boulder jutting out from underneath an outcropping in the mountainside. As I got closer, I was able to see more clearly through the rain that it wasn't a boulder at all, but the knee of a rather large individual who was mostly tucked up under the ledge of the rocks in an apparent attempt to get out of the rain. The giant spoke in a soft cadence, explaining that he'd been attempting to get out of the rain and offered for me to join him, as he gave me a kind expression. He seemed to expect some hesitancy, but I simply gave a curt nod before moving to find my place under the ledge beside him. What fear I felt at first coming across him had faded when I realized he was just a giant, not something malicious. Giants typically were kind folk, as long as you didn't cross them yourself first. Getting out of the rain was a welcome reprieve, especially given the fact that I knew I was unlikely to find the cynic ivy until it let up. Their creeping vines often curled up tight in rainy weather, odd given their habit of inflicting rainy dispositions on those who mishandled them. The giant broke the silence that had settled between us with a comment on how he had not seen me around before, and I looked up to find he watched me with his wise eyes. I set my bag carefully aside for the time being, so I could lean back against the stone face of the rocks easier. I took the time as we sat to explain that I'd been in the area for less than a month and what my purpose here was. At the mention of the previous witch, a look of surprise crossed the giant's face, and he turned to dig through the large satchel he kept at his own side. When he turned back to me, he offered up a bound novel that he carefully cradled in his hands. He said that he had been wondering why she hadn't been back to get it, as it was one of her favorite books. She had loaned it to him a long while ago, but then never returned. He had thought of going to town to return it, but explained he didn't like to go down there often, as most people didn't appreciate his presence there. I took the book, surprised, as I flipped through some of the pages, and found it well loved and earmarked, along with some notations in the margins. It seemed to be an adventure book of sorts, though I will need to take more time to read it through it fully to see. I asked the giant if he minded me taking it, and he said not at all, given I was currently living in the witch's home and looking for her. It seemed I would be a good fit to return it to her when she was found, and, well, if she wasn't found, then it was at least passed on to someone new who may enjoy it. The rain had started to let up, but I lingered for a while longer, as I wondered what else I might be able to learn. But I knew that I had a patient to care for, and I still needed to find the Cynic Ivy, as well as make it down to the lock for one more reagent before the time was out. The giant gave his name as Folly before we parted, and I promised I would return at a later time to sit and talk with him more. I hoped that I would be able to glean some idea of what the previous witch may have been up to before she disappeared if we spoke further. For the time being, though, as the rain slowed down to a soft mist, I ducked back out of the overhang and hiked on further along the now muddy path until I spotted an area of curled thick vines along the bottom of one of the rock faces. It took a few moments to verify that it was Cynic Ivy before I collected it up and started back down the mountain towards the lock. Card drawn is a 9. Timer is at 4. Heading down to the lock took less time than the hike up, in part due to me practically sliding down through the mud on the top half of the trail. As I reached the shore, the skies were still gray, though the air was at least warmer down here, and there seemed to be little promise of more rain. It was easy to spot the towering form of the deep reed, rising out of the water a short ways offshore near a swampy area that branched out to some small islands in the lake. I went to the docks in hopes of finding a small rowboat that I had seen there during one of my previous visits, and was relieved to find it still tethered in place. I was of the mind at this point that whoever owned the boat wouldn't mind me borrowing it, given they likely wouldn't ever find out as it was. It would be my only way out to the islands that didn't involve trying to swim and wade through the murky waters. I untethered the boat and started to row out towards the islands where the reeds swayed. Partway there, a melody suddenly caught my ear as it rafted over the water, and I felt myself struck by it. I stopped rowing altogether to listen as it drifted upon the breeze from one of the islands further out into the lake. It was a soft and sad song that made my heart ache with longing, as I hadn't felt for years now, and without realizing, I found myself rowing out further into the water. Part of me knew that I should stop, that it was ill-advised, and that whatever was singing out on the island was likely to be a danger, but I never stilled in my rowing. If anything, I sped up as the song grew louder. I came across a grove of the deep reed, where the singing seemed to be coming from, the source somewhere hidden within. I nudged the boat between the stalks, ignored the oily sheen it left across the bow of the boat as I drifted through. Suddenly, she came into my view, singing with her eyes closed as she sat waist deep in the water along the shore, as the deep reeds swayed around her in waves. I watched, tranced for a few moments, until some perceived imperfection in her song made her cut the notes short and give a curse. It was only then that she seemed to realize I was there, and it was only then that I realized just how foolish I had been to follow the siren's call. Both of us stared at the other for a long moment before a tumble of words started to come out of her mouth. I sat, a bit shocked by the fact that I wasn't being attacked by the siren, and I had fully expected to take advantage of the fact she'd lured me there. Instead, she seemed almost contrite as she slipped further into the water to slide up next to the boat. As my wits returned to me, I realized that she was apologizing as she stated her intention hadn't been to lure anyone out to her, but that she'd only been practicing. She had apparently thought no one would be on the lock given the rain that had just passed through. It took me a few more seconds to get back on stable footing after the lyre of a song, followed by the unexpected apology. Sirens weren't known for letting those they snared go. I kept this in mind as I found my voice and assured her that it was quite all right. There was a certain curiosity and eagerness in how she looked at me that made me feel uncomfortable still. She suddenly offered to get me a fish, her words a quick tumble like before, as if they couldn't escape her mouth fast enough. Before I could even protest, she dived below the surface of the water, and I found myself alone. My first instinct was to leave the moment she was out of sight, but caution stopped me as I didn't want to start rowing immediately after she dived down and give myself away. Angering her would do no good, especially when I still had a reagent to gather. I carefully started to gather some of the deep reed, instead, as I watched for some sign of her return. Once I had collected what I needed, and she still hadn't come back up, then I started to row my way back out to the head to shore. I rowed at a calm and steady pace, kept the oars from causing too much disturbance on the surface as I went. I had reached the midway point back to the docks when with a splash she reappeared, holding a fossil fish in her hands. She spoke in that same rushed manner, chastising me for moving, as she had feared she wouldn't find me again. She shoved the fish into my hands, and I accepted it numbly, as she instructed me to keep him in fresh water until I needed him. I clarified that it wasn't very good to eat, but may be useful other ways. I started to get the sense that she wasn't like the sirens I had come across on the shores of the Tamira Sea, who are known for delighting in a good shipwreck. I thanked her for the fish, and she seemed to only confirm this feeling by apologizing again, commenting that Follix was typically the only one she usually saw out on the waters. At the mention of the dwarf, I tried to ask how she knew him, but she was gone once more in a flash as she dived under the water. I was left holding the fish in my hands as it gasped lazily, but put up no struggle as if it didn't mind its current risk of suffocation. I pulled a jar from my bag then, and as I didn't want it to continue to suffer, and filled it with water from the lake before I dropped the fish into it. It would need a larger enclosure if I was going to keep it alive once I got back home, but I could also easily dry it out once I was back home to preserve the scales. I knew I would end up keeping it as she had suggested, even as the thought crossed my mind. I finished rowing ashore with my small bounty of deep reed and the unexpected fish friend to head back to the witch's house once more. I'd be able to help relieve the young adventurer of his affliction and give his friend some peace of mind at least. Hopefully that would also be more honest with me about the vampire who drank from their friend in the first place. Taste of Life. This potion has a +1 to poison. Ingredients include deep reed ×1 crushed, nest scrapings ×1 crushed, and cynic ivy ×1 boiled. Step 1. Isolate the leaves of the cynic ivy and rinse them under cold water. Place them in a cauldron along with 2 cups of water and place them over the fire to bring to a boil. Step 2. While that boils, take deep reed and place it in your mortar. Crush it until only an oily substance remains. Decant this into a separate glass. Step 3. Take nest scraps and place into mortar and crush with pestle until turned into a fine powder. Step 4. Remove the cynic ivy concoction from the fire and allow it to sit for 5 minutes to cool. Step 5. Combine the fine powdered nest scraps with the oily substance from the deep reeds and mix well until a paste forms. Step 6. To paste, pour in the liquid from the cynic ivy in small quantities at a time and mix until a dough-like substance forms. Step 7. Once dough is formed, set to bake until it turns a golden color with hints of the reddish oil on the surface. Be careful not to burn. If the top is dry and cracked, you have cooked the dough too long. Step 8. Have the afflicted eat the cooked dough in its entirety. Observe for the next 24 hours, including overnight, to ensure reaffliction doesn't occur before the individual can fully heal. All windows must be kept closed and bound with garlic. I made the group of them stay until I knew that their friend would keep the bread down, and then instructed them that he would need constant monitoring for the next 24 hours. I did my best to stress how important this was, not wanting them to dismiss the seriousness of the situation. And it was a relief to find that at least a few of them seemed to understand. My patient, for his part, seemed much more revived by the time they all left, and I hoped that the vampire who had struck him in the first place wouldn't try to return. It was more the fear he'd be bit again that made it necessary he be watched, the Indian monitoring of his recovery at this point. I did try to get them to give me more details once more on where he may have come across the vampire in the first place. But given I hold little to no real authority here to begin with, much less with a group of young adventurers, it ended up being fruitless. It didn't help that they all seemed to be under the impression that I wasn't the most stalwart figure, given their other friend Sean, who appeared to still be giving the impression that he helped me out of the dungeon the week prior. I couldn't help but notice that he hadn't come with the others to seek help from his friends. Still, I felt no real need to try and argue for the truth of the matter, given it was likely to fall on deaf ears as it was. My ability to cure their friends seemed to help earn me some trust and reputation at least, as they went on their way. Once I was alone again, I attempted to get my new fish friend settled in a more permanent sort of habitat that would keep him fresh at least long enough for me to have use for him. I didn't have what is necessary for keeping him thriving for a long time, but I did at least get him into a bowl with some fresh water until I had a chance to get him cured and dried to save his scales for later. For the day, he gets to live content in his small bowl of loch water, the way only a fossil fish could. Once that was all settled, I sat down at my table to pore over the book the giant had given me. It was my third potential clue in regards to the former witch, though what sort of help it may provide, I still have no idea. I scanned through its pages, marked every notation that I could find in its margin, and noted which pages were folded over in the corner more often than others. I knew it was likely more attention than a simple borrowed book warranted, but I still need to go on. The story wasn't an adventure tale, as I had originally thought, but what struck me was that it seemed to be set in the area. There was mention at one point in a notation from the Witch of the Lake within the story being the same as Meltwater Loch. Whether there was any truth to this or just a curious observation that she felt to make is beyond me. Most of the notations didn't make much sense, while others seemed to be simply reactions to what was happening in the course of the story. I will need to take time to sit and read the full book to have a true grasp on what may be happening within the pages. But it feels as if there might be some promise of something that can point me in the right direction still. April 13th. I have been taking what free time I have to read through the book. I constantly feel that I am on the verge of something that I just haven't grasped yet. The tale itself is familiar in a way most adventures are. A hero who goes through trials and doubts only to find purpose, and what I am sure will be a triumph in the end once I reach it. Sitting in the quiet house, I've also found myself debating something for myself. Something that I have long delayed, but feel that this may be the right time to finally do. Given my uncertainty on where my search will lead, I know it would be beneficial to have someone at my side that I could trust and who could lend a hand. So, I've decided I need to call upon a familiar tonight when the full moon rises. I don't make this decision lightly. There is a reason I haven't called upon one before this, even though a travel companion would have been a welcomed addition over the years. Familiars, just as they can be called, can also be lost. And when that happens, it would leave behind a hole that was difficult to move past. I had done it once before and never had the intention to do it again. But perhaps it's time to move beyond some of those old roadblocks. April 14th. Last night, I headed out into the back garden around midnight to gather stones and petals from the flowers that had come up wild among the paths. From there, I headed down to the loch, as it is the place I've become the most familiar with since I arrived here, and it felt like the most fitting location to perform the calling. I set up just outside the tree line, not right on the shore, but within sight of it, not wanting to be too out in the open as I worked. I laid a circle of stones and flowers before I took my place in the center to sit and look up at the moon as it illuminated the world around me in a soft blue glow. It had been a long time since I had performed a calling, and my heart ached a bit as I sat there. I felt like an echo of that sadness invoked by the siren's song earlier in the week. I closed my eyes and focused as I poured my magic into the circle around me. I felt it come alive, amplified as it wrapped around and surrounded me. The night was quiet, silent in a way that only magic can make it. I strained to hear any sign of a voice. I feared that I wouldn't hear one, that no one would come, and that I'd find there was no answer to my call. I sat for so long that I thought it must surely be the case, but I forced myself to wait, held my breath to listen all the more intently. I could feel tears on my face, certain that it was of no use, and ready to give up, when I heard the voice. It was quiet, but sure as it called from somewhere in the distance. I reached out to it, answered its call almost too eagerly, and heard it once more. I asked for it to come to me, to follow the sound of my magic, and could feel it draw closer and closer, until I finally opened my eyes to find myself face to face with her. Card drawn is a 10, indicating a mount. The elk stood in front of me. Large doe eyes met mine in a peaceful manner, and I couldn't help myself as I reached up to wrap my arms around her neck in a hug that solidified the tether between us. I heard her name in the back of my mind as I stood at last. The circle around us glowed softly with its own sort of moonlight as I ran a hand down along her neck. Briar. Marcius. And that is the end of week 4. We did again finish a case, so our reputation rises to 7, and we would have gotten 20 silver, so our silver rises to 69. Nice. And that is the end of the stream today. So, next week will actually be the start of the new gameplay. With it being the start of new gameplay, it might be broken back down into just being 1 week gameplay per stream. I may get 2 weeks in, but from here on out, since I haven't already played these weeks, I will be playing them before the stream, writing up these journal entries, and it will be the same format on stream, but it will be something that I played just that week. So next week we'll start our new stuff that has not been streamed previously. So I want to say thank you to anyone who has stopped by. I appreciate it. And I hope you guys are all having a wonderful weekend. Happy Easter to those who celebrate it. If you don't celebrate it, happy weekend. So next Sunday, same time, 4 p.m. And yeah, we'll be starting new stuff then. So thank you, and I hope you all have a wonderful week. Bye.